Hey folks, so I am going to be going through some of the changes that are coming to the Revelations cards. And before we jump into this, I want to preface this by saying that I'm recording this in advance of the patch going live because the devs were nice enough to let me see those changes in advance so that I could record the video in a timely fashion. However, I am not involved in the balancing process. So these are not anything that I've influenced whatsoever. So my opinions that I'm going to be expressing here are entirely independent of the design process. But I want to talk about the changes to the cards, how it affects those cards, and my opinion on those balance changes. And I'm not going to go through this in any particular order. I'm just going to go in the order that these were actually sent to me. So we're going to begin with Carlotta's Arbitrator. And the original version of this card was a card that I expressed that I wasn't excited about. And I think other people may have felt similar because it's a very high cost card that has a deploy effect denial ability on it. And the deploy effect denial is a pretty interesting mechanic, but not one that I think most people wanted to see on an 8 cost card. So the new version of the card is still the same. However, it has an additional line of text. You can opt to play Carlotta's Arbitrator for only 3 resources, but if you do, it gets removed at the start of combat, which is really interesting. So it makes Carlotta's Arbitrator a kind of like a counterspell, but for deploy effects. And then if you have enough resources, it can be deployed as an actual character. And basically, this is just a straight up buff. The card is better. I think it's more interesting. I don't know if it's the direction I would have gone personally with it, but what's I think important to say is that Infinity Wars, compared to other digital card games, is more agile in terms of rebalancing. And if this was a different card game, Carlotta's Arbitrator probably would have just been left as a dead card. And even though this isn't the change that I would have made, it is a change that makes the card more interesting and more playable. And that's not something you'd see from another card game. It's a matter of Infinity Wars, because it provides all the cards for free, doesn't have to worry about making players feel like they've gotten ripped off somehow if a card gets changed, because you already own all the cards. And the small player base and the developers doing a lot of communication with the community makes it easier for these changes to happen. So cool. That's out of the way, and that's the case for really all the cards. But I thought it was worth bringing up with Carlotta's Arbitrator. Next card that's gotten changed is Death in Heaven, and this card deserved the change. It's really, really, really good. So it was 8 cost, and now it's 10 cost. And that seems entirely reasonable. That the card at 8 cost was unbelievable. That it is more or less an unconditional board wipe, and is sometimes better than just a unconditional board wipe, because by leaning into that tokens distinction, you can build your deck in a way where it doesn't hit your characters nearly as often as it hits your opponents. So very frequently this card was overperforming. I've been on the receiving end of this card many times, and it does not feel good, and there isn't really any way to play around it, because it can be one-sided. Your opponent can be deploying characters knowing full well that the board wipe isn't going to affect them. So your choices are either lose on the board by not playing your characters, holding them back in your hand, and waiting for them to board wipe, in which case you will lose because you're getting outpaced by their characters, or deploy your characters anyways, in which case Death in Heaven will put you so far behind that you'll never recover. So this is a very warranted change, and I think the card is still going to be quite powerful even at 10 cost, to be completely honest. Okay, next, Serpent of the Western Wind. And undeniably, I think it's fair to say, so now that we've gone through, we already did my spice ratings about how excited I am about the card, so now I can be transparent and talk about how powerful the cards are. Serpent of the Western Wind as a 4/4 was just horrendous. The card was awful. And now it is a 6/8, which is a lot better. A lot better. Do I think it's enough to make the card interesting and playable? I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't know if it's enough. But there is no question that this is a step in the right direction, and maybe it is enough. Only time will tell, but at 4/4, the card was incredibly vulnerable to all kinds of different removal effects that were very resource efficient. So it just wasn't worth it. So, great change. All right, next card we have is Tormented Eidolon. And this is an interesting change because I think for a lot of people, this change is one that they may have not even realized needed to happen. Because I haven't seen the card or gotten a chance to play with it in game, just by coincidence. I've been playing, but I haven't gotten the chance to make a deck, and I haven't seen anybody using it. The original version of the card, the extra resource and the +2/+2 were not both tied to it being on the battlefield. When I read the card, I thought that it was. And now it's been changed to be a little more clear. It's technically a nerf, so now it has to be on the battlefield to take advantage of both the +2/+2 and the extra resource. And maybe you didn't even notice that those were tied to two separate zones before, but now it's one zone. So I think the card at a minimum is less confusing, which I think is always a good change, that having cards be easier to understand on first read through is important. It is a nerf, but I think the card's still really interesting, so hopefully it's still strong enough to make an impact. Okay, next we have Sabertooth Snail. And again, full transparency, I haven't gotten a chance to test this card, but it was an 8 health card, and now it has 6 health. And without having played it myself, I really don't know how strongly I feel about this change. I think it's reasonable to say that the stats on the card were pretty egregious before, and that's kind of the purpose of the card, the whole point of the card. And it hurts to hear that it's getting nerfed, but at the same time, I, as somebody who didn't get to play with it or play against it, maybe I'm not fully in tune with how strong it was. Maybe it was really unfun to play against. So no strong feelings here either way, just because I didn't get too much exposure to it. Okay, we have Jade Golem, and Jade Golem has been buffed to 12 health, and this is really, really significant because the card is artificial, and artificial characters take 8 damage from Lightning Blast. And Lightning Blast is so ubiquitous for any deck that has one Veror Purity that Jade Golem was extremely vulnerable as a card that was high cost and easy to kill with a 1 cost card. That it's nice to see this buff. I don't think that this is going to change the game in any way other than make people who want to play Jade Golem not regret their decision to play it as soon as they queue into a Veror deck. Okay, next we have Cassiel's Grave, which again is actually tied to Cassiel the Betrayed. And I kind of talked about this when I reviewed the card, but having to go through the exercise of getting Cassiel the Betrayed killed and then having to play Cassiel's Grave to like tap into it felt like a lot of work for what it is. That's been adjusted. So now Cassiel's Grave only costs 3 resources. That's a pretty significant discount and makes it feel a lot easier to take advantage of that bonus card that you're getting out of Cassiel. So I'm a big fan of that change, and it makes me feel more comfortable trying Cassiel the Betrayed out. All right, next, Dragon Tamer. And before we talk about Dragon Tamer, this is a card that I did get to play with, and I also played against, and I think the card is better than people gave it credit for. That if you're running it in the command zone, it being a 4-cost 10-12, it's not quite Bromic, but it turns out slamming a 4-cost 10-12 out of the command zone is a pretty solid baseline, and then the option to roll the dice and potentially get some dragons was nice. That I played the triple Flamed On Dragon Tamer deck, and I saw somebody else play double Flamed On Warpath Dragon Tamer. They had fair success. I had a fair bit of success. But what I will say, though, is that Dragon Tamer really did not feel like the star of that deck most of the time. That turns out just playing triple Flamed On wins you a lot of games, and the Dragon Tamer didn't even matter most of the time. So enough of that. Let's talk about what Dragon Tamer is now. So now, instead of it being exhaust to tap into its effect, it's once per turn. So the significance there is that prior to this change, I mentioned that sometimes it's nice to just slam Dragon Tamer as a 10-12. Prior to this change, if you slammed it as a 10-12, if you wanted to tap into its dragon producing effect, you'd have to take it off the battlefield. So this allows you to continue to attack or defend with it while still generating those dragons. And then in additional, it only generates dragons that cost 6 or more, which is a huge buff, because pulling Aoshun out, Aoshun Incognito, the tiny Aoshun out, was not great. I will say that when I did that, I would just pitch the tiny Aoshun to get another dragon, because there's nothing stopping you from doing that. But I do appreciate that the card is a little more consistent now. Okay. Next, another card that I got a chance to test, and I think that some people felt was very weak, but I disagree with. That was Illegal Magitech. I tested the card, and I was able to get it to consistently perform better than Research without it feeling painful to do so. That being said, it still was only marginally better, and card draw is actually very easy to get in Infinity Wars. So I appreciate that this is getting changed. I don't feel like it needed to get changed, but the change certainly makes the card more powerful and much more interesting. Now it is a 2-cost card. And as a 2-cost card, so I would originally have said, having played Illegal Magitech as a 3-cost card, that maybe it was like a C to B student. Like, it's nothing to write home about, gets the job done. At a 2-cost card, I expect this card to be somewhere between a B and an A. So hopefully you'll see the card a little more. Hopefully it'll be interesting. And that's really what matters, is just that it keeps the game interesting. All right, next we have Project Hellfire. A very simple change. The morale cost on the card has been increased to 3. So just a slight nerf. And I really like this change, and I would like to see balance changes using morale costs more frequently, because what's cool about the change to morale cost as opposed to something else is that you can continue to play the card the exact same way, but it does nerf the card and reduce its win rate. It's just inevitable that increasing the morale cost will reduce the win rate, but it lets somebody continue to play the card and feel like it's powerful. So I like that change, and you can continue to play the card because it's basically the same most of the time, and then occasionally you'll just run out of morale. All right, next, micro rift research, and this had a pretty significant change. So cost is increased by 1. That's already pretty big. And then the preemptive has been removed, and that I think is also really, really big. That having been recognized, I think that micro rift research was really, really strong. That at 3 cost, the card was incredibly efficient, even without taking a look at the fact that it has recall. So, a reasonable change. I wish that they had maybe done just one of these, like increase the cost or remove preemptive, and then maybe instead look at adjusting its recall cost. But it doesn't matter. I think this is a fair change, and probably one that's healthy for the game. Next, Nero's Experiment, and this mechanically changes the card in a way that I actually didn't realize that it didn't work this way, because I, again, have not seen this card in-game, and I haven't played it myself in-game. So the card lets you take one of your opponent's characters out of the graveyard, and when that character dies, it raises from the graveyard after 3 turns, just like Risen of Avarak. However, I had assumed that raising from the graveyard effect was permanent, and it wasn't. I thought it basically was a build your own Risen of Avarak. That is not how the card originally worked. Now it does work that way. So this is a straight up buff, but there might be other people like myself that didn't even realize it didn't work that way in the first place. So appreciate the change, and I think it does actually make the card work more like I would have expected it to in the first place, which is good. Okay, next we have Bile Imp, and Bile Imp exile cost is changed from 2 to 3. Seems fair. Nothing exciting about this change, but Bile Imp was a really cost-efficient card, especially as a 2-drop. As a 2-drop, it was really, really strong. That the card is too efficient to be a 2-drop. So it's totally fair that it costs 3 with its exile cost. That Exiles has no problem pitching cards from the hand, so it's not like I don't think you deserve the discount for activating Vanash when you were going to do it anyways. Okay, next, and this is one, of course, that I'm excited about. Ireal, Champion of Tenacity, has been buffed. The card has gone from a 4/2 to a 6/6. This was a much-needed change in terms of the card being a legendary that wasn't really up to snuff with other legendaries. I don't know how huge of an impact this card is going to have, but taking it outside of the range of basically dying to everything in the game is very significant. That the card was so vulnerable to really everything, and now it can more reasonably attack multiple times without you having to bend over backwards to make it happen. And I will admittedly add, I have actually tested Ireal as a 4/2 quite a bit, and she wasn't nearly as bad as I thought she was going to be. However, because the card is a legendary, I do think that it's entirely reasonable that the card gets a little more oomph than your typical card. So, good buff. All right, next, Spiritfire Disciple, and the card has been changed so that now, instead of it just being when it is attacking alone and getting +8, +0, and healing, now it also does this when it is defending alone, which is a very significant buff. I think the card is, I mean, like, it's undeniably objectively better now. I think, though, that one of the underlying issues for Spiritfire Disciple, which can't be addressed by buffing or nerfing it, is that playing Descendants of the Dragons and Flame Dawn together is just hard. That I tried to build a deck, and I really struggled to make it work. Maybe somebody can send me a deck list, and I'll give it a shot. Somebody could teach me how to do that. But I think that this card is much better now, much cooler. It's a stronger card, but I just don't know if we're going to see much Descendants of the Dragons and Flame Dawn together as it stands. Okay. Next, Dracen's Revolutionary, and this card got buffed. I will say that I, again, tested this one in Logarithmatron, and I was quite pleased with how it was performing, even before this buff. But the buff, according to the notes that I've got, is primarily to help the card feel a little less clunky when Rift Run or Draft comes out. So it's got +3 health now. It goes from a 15-5 to a 15-8. And it's objectively a buff. I don't know how much it's going to change the viability of the card, because I think that you're going to use it in Logarithmatron either way. At least my experience with it was very positive. So it's just better. Pretty cool. All right, next we have Fickle Friendship. And Fickle Friendship is a card I did not play with, and I have not had it played against me. So I can't really comment very strongly on the card, but it's been nerfed. It's gone from 6 cost to 7 cost. And you won't hear any complaints from me, because I can imagine the card being frustrating to play against. Even though I didn't play against it, it's the Infinity Wars already, I think, heavily favors lower cost, efficient characters, and having your opponent punish you for playing a less cost efficient character by taking it from you and giving you one of their kind of lower cost pieces of garbage is pretty rough. So, reasonable nerf. I don't know how strong the card was or not, but I can definitely imagine it being frustrating. All right, next, Subject One of Many, and somebody did let me know that it's not Subject One over Money. It's Subject One of Many. Makes a lot of sense. But the stats have been reduced. It's gone from a 5/12 to a 5/9. Totally expected. I would say that the card is a card that has a reasonably efficient body and replaces itself, and replaces its health with a very specific card. Like, you can have it find specific cards by curating which characters in your deck have 15 plus attack. So this doesn't shock me, and seems very reasonable. All right, next, Rift Stabilizer, and the activation cost on the card has been reduced from 3 to 2, and that seems entirely reasonable. That this card feels like it was intended to be kind of like a dog enabler. Maybe you combo with some other deploy effects, but you have to pay 3 upfront for the card, and then an additional 3 plus remove a character that you have from potentially a zone that it could be defending or attacking in. So it's already a pretty steep cost, even before you factor in like the additional resources. So totally reasonable reduction in cost there. All right. Next, we have Vesta Firebrand Commander. I did get to play with it a bit, and the card was fine. But I can imagine that this buff is just to make the card feel a little more exciting rather than just fine. And the buff is to add 4 health to the card. So now instead of having 10 health, it has 14. And what's good about that is it will allow Vesta to more frequently get its multiple attacks off. Because as it stands, if she attacks and they have one big defender, she will most likely just kill herself on the first attack, possibly the second attack, and this just makes it more likely that she can do her thing. All right, next we have Koro, Finder of Ways, and this merits some discussion here. So the version that I reviewed in my Spice videos never made it into the game. And I was excited about that version. I think the card was very interesting, and I think there would have been cool decks you could build around it. However, a different version got released, and the different version is unquestionably much stronger, and also far more forgiving in what kind of deck you can use it in. The original version of the card, you really had to build a specified deck around it. The new version of the card, frankly, you can play it in any deck that runs characters, and because the supplies that she provides also affect tokens, you even have cards that you can double dip by producing several tokens on, or have token producers in the command zone. So the card was really, really, really good. And had very few restrictions in terms of where you could use it, because it was one purity, and it benefited basically any deck that was running a significant number of characters. Okay, all that being said, very reasonable nerf. Instead of it costing 2 to produce one of the supplies, now it costs 3. And that is probably enough of a nerf. That the reality is that very frequently you could get away with just skipping your second turn of the game to produce supplies and not get punished for it. The same really is unlikely to be said about skipping your third turn in the game to produce supplies. That now there's a more meaningful decision tree that a player is going to have to go down. Okay, and we have a couple more here. So we've got Scepter of the Deep. This is one I got to try. This is one I got to see other people play. I thought the card was pretty good in its original state. However, it was only good in very specialized decks, and those decks were not demon tribal decks. They were control decks that aimed to create really grindy games. And if you tapped into, I believe it's Contained Parallel Rift, if I'm remembering the card name correctly, you could cycle through your deck and just throw out lots of demons and continue to pressure the board while holding up lots of removal. Which was a cool way to play the card, and you can still do that. However, it's been buffed to try to help the card exist into some other ecosystems, maybe in a demon tribal deck or somewhere else. So now, instead of shuffling the 2 demons into your deck, it is going to put 1 into your hand and 1 into your deck. And that is a really, really big buff, because the card is kind of drawing you a card every turn. So it's objectively better. I think this is the most likely balance change here to backfire. I think all the other balance changes track to me as being entirely reasonable. This one, I think the card is going to be really, really strong. Maybe not strong enough to break the game, but it's going to be really, really, really good in a lot of decks. And I think it's also worth adding here that currently Scepter of the Deep is not unique, if I'm remembering correctly. And having multiple of them out in the original version of the card really didn't do a whole lot for you, but having multiple of them out now is going to be putting those tokens into your hand at an alarming rate. So, very strong card. We'll see how that one plays out. And then our last card that has been changed is Believer of Paragons, and this card has received very substantial changes. That it's not just a balance change, the card has been entirely reworked. So, the original version of the card was kind of like a Martyr Golem sort of card, but for unique characters, and also had this interesting hand buffing characteristic to it, but it was a very weird card. Now, the card, I think, has a more clear identity, but still has some shared elements. Now, at the beginning of combat, if Believer of Paragons is deployed, the first unique character in your assault zone gains indestructible until end of turn, which basically lets you build your own Iberian. And that's a really strong effect, and it's also a much cooler effect than the original one, because it encourages you to do some interesting things with the card. And then the second half of the card, it's still pay 3, but instead of giving characters in your hand, or unique characters in your hand +3/+0, now it's unique characters in your hand and command zone get +2/+2, which is, I think, quite a bit better. I prefer +2/+2 to +3/+0 most of the time. I think health is a very important stat, and the fact that it hits the command zone as well is kind of nifty. And that's all of the balance changes. I'm curious to hear what other people think. It was quite a long video, actually, but I think because of that, we really ought to give a shout out to our devs for putting so much thought into which cards to change and how to change them, as well as the folks in the community that provided feedback on these cards, because I know a lot of these changes were pushed through by players who are interested in making the game more fun and healthy for everybody. Okay, and with that, hope you folks have a nice day, and I'll see you all soon.